All right, ladies and gentlemen, today's lesson is going to answer the essential question, what pushed tensions between England and the 13 colonies into open conflict? So that should be a left side question in your Cornell notes. And so we're going to be discussing the follow-up to all those taxes that the British passed that annoyed the colonists and started creating tension between the colonists and Great Britain after the French Indian War. Keep in mind that the British wanted to find ways to pay for that war because in many ways the war was fought to benefit the colonists, but the colonists didn't really appreciate the British passing all these taxes when they didn't have any representation, when they didn't have any say in how those taxes would be passed. So Britain's actions and choices really began to upset the colonists. Some people argue the British had every right to pass the taxes and that the colonists were acting like spoiled children. Some people think the colonists had every right to be upset. You can have your own perspective on that. Boston was kind of the nexus of all of this. Boston was kind of where this really came down and became very, very stressful. In Boston, there was literally one British soldier for every 5 colonists. So imagine you're walking around on the street and you see US soldiers hanging out everywhere. I know in Mexico that's a little bit more common. Here in the United States, that would be very, very unnerving to us. So on March 5th, 1770, there was a riot in Boston where basically the citizens of Boston were protesting the British presence in the city and what the British were doing. And that riot became very violent. Now, violent in quotes. They were throwing snowballs. They were insulting the British troops. They were throwing rocks, but it was pretty tame stuff. But these British soldiers, they were 18 and 19 years old. They were far from home. They were across the ocean from the home they knew. They didn't really want to be there. And they were young kids. So as this riot started to escalate, and we can kind of consider, what's taken place in Portland or other cities across America this summer. Imagine those dynamics. The British soldiers eventually opened fire on this crowd, and they weren't ordered to open fire. It was accidental. It was probably a soldier that lost his nerve, and once one soldier lost his nerve, the rest of the soldiers lost their nerve, and it became a snowball rolling downhill. No pun intended. So you may have heard of a guy named Paul Revere. If you look at this engraving on the right side here, you are looking at his drawing or engraving of what happened at the Boston Massacre. Now, keep in mind, only 5 people were killed at the Boston Massacre. And I don't want to say only because anybody is too much, but if you look at this picture, it looks like the colonists were mowed down like blades of grass. And that's why this picture is an example of what we call propaganda, because if you can convince people that something was worse than it actually was, that gets them riled up. This picture showed up in all of the newspapers in all of the 13 colonies. And because there was no TV then, there was no radio then, this picture was the news. And so even though Paul Revere exaggerated it, it got all 13 colonies really riled up against the British. And so on the next slide, I'm going to show you a video reenactment of the Boston Massacre.
Yes? Can you breathe? Come on, you suffer the full penalty of the law! People need you, Lieutenant. You will not help.
All right, so that's a video reenactment of the Boston Massacre. The guy who screamed murderers at the end, that was Paul Revere. He's the guy who did the engraving, who got in all the newspapers and got all the colonists riled up to really want to start fighting back and resisting the British. So our next topic is going to be the Boston Tea Party. So our left side question, which I've already put in your notes for you, is what was the Boston Tea Party? This occurred later on. The Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party were actually 3 years apart. So keep that in mind. There's 3 years are passing, so we're going forward in time 3 years. In 1773, Lord North passed the Tea Act. This was another attempt by the British to get the colonists to pay them money, and this was a way to trick the colonists into paying a tax, because the tax itself was only 3 cents, 3 pennies per pound of tea, and they actually lowered the price of tea. So in the end, what the colonists would pay would be less, but because there was a tax involved, the colonists still didn't play the game. It required the colonists to buy tea from the British East India Company, which I like to abbreviate as the BEIC, and it reduced the rate on tea. But basically, this was an attempt by the British to say, no matter what, we're still in charge. You have to pay this tax, even though we're really not going to make that much money off the tax. At this point, it was less about making money for the British and more about saying, we're still in charge, whether you like it or not. So the colonists really resented being told who to buy the tea from. And this is where we started drinking coffee in the United States of America. You know, we love our coffee here in the United States. Starbucks started here in the United States. If you go to countries that are still part of the British Commonwealth, they still take tea at noon. Tea is still a much larger part of their culture. American culture really started to change when the colonists resisted the Tea Act and started drinking coffee instead. So they boycotted, vocabulary word, the tea, and started drinking coffee. On December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, which was the name of an organization put together to start organizing resistance to the British, they dressed up like Mohawk Native Americans. Not the best thing on earth, but they dressed up like them, basically put on essentially blackface to look like Native Americans. They boarded the tea ships in Boston Harbor, and they dumped 90,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. That tea was worth money. The British Empire wanted that money. And so when the British found out about this, they were none too pleased. And a lot of my students always ask me, does that mean that Boston Harbor like turned into a giant tea harbor? If you know anything about Boston Harbor, you would not have wanted to dip your teacup into that harbor and try and drink the water, because quite frankly, Boston Harbor is gross. And it was probably gross back then too, although not as gross as today. Today, you would not want to dip a teacup into Boston Harbor. So the next slide is a video that kind of summarizes the Boston Tea Party for you.
now. Back in England, the colonial rebellion becomes a national preoccupation. Over the next 3 years, Parliament keeps trying to impose its authority with new laws and new taxes. As each new law inflames the rebellion, it ends up getting repealed. Except for one, a tax on tea.
The principle involved is that Parliament is sovereign. It can pass laws whenever it wants. So we're going to just keep this one in place just because to assert the fact that we can do this.
The Tea Act puts only a 3-penny tax per pound on the drink of choice for most Americans. It's hardly a burden, but in the current climate, a 3-penny tax still equals oppression. It's all that militant patriots need to strike another blow against the empire. Feathers and coal dust are their weapons. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty enlist 50 men to darken their faces, stick feathers in their hair, and arm themselves with hatchets in a bad impersonation of Mohawk Indians. 5,000 people follow them down to Boston Harbor and watch as they climb aboard a merchant ship loaded with tea from England. With British soldiers absent since the Boston Massacre, there is no one to stop them. 342 crates of tea worth 10,000 British pounds are cast overboard. This wanton act of sabotage, which becomes known as the Boston Tea Party, will soon push the two sides to the brink of war.
The British reaction was disgust and outrage. From a British point of view, you had an entire colony running amok. And the British government, after the Tea Act, frankly said, we've had enough. Had enough of Massachusetts. And we're going to clamp down on them. And we're going to make Massachusetts an example of what happens if you defy the authority of Parliament.
At that very same time, the British discovered yet another outrage committed by an American, someone they thought they could trust, Benjamin Franklin.
All right, so that is a little summary of the Boston Tea Party for you. On the next slide, you'll notice on your graphic organizer, I have a little box for a summary. I think I do want you to practice that skill. If we were actually in class, I would be having you write a summary at the bottom of your notes in your interactive notebooks. So instead, I'm going to have you type it on the study guide I created for you. And while you guys are typing a 3 to 5 sentence summary where you talk about the most important things you learned in this lesson, I am going to show you a video by Hip Hughes History. John Green does the crash course videos. This is another guy, Hip Hughes. He's a teacher in Buffalo, New York. And secretly, I want my YouTubing and video teaching skills to reach this level, but I'm not quite there yet. So while you're watching this, write your summaries, please.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History as we travel back to December 16, 1773. We're going to go to Boston, Massachusetts and have a little bit of a tea party. How about that? I hope you're thirsty. Thirsty for the learning. So why don't we examine exactly what was the Boston Tea Party, how exactly it occurred, and if you're a kid in school, you know we're going to look at the consequences. So why don't we giddy up for the learning and go get her done right now. All right, guys, a little bit of backdropping before we get to the big night, December 16th, 1773. And really, we can start in 1733 in terms of the first time the British Parliament is going to pass a tax, that be an indirect tax on the American colonists. It's called the Molasses Act. And 6 pence per gallon, my friend, And this wasn't a tax designed to raise revenue. It was really a tax that was designed to protect large plantation owners in the British West Indies from French competition. But the effect is going to be that it's going to raise prices on molasses in the Northeast, where it's primarily being manufactured into product, and it's going to hurt the New England economy. So this is where we get the roots of boycott, of buying local, of the black market, of smugglers. It's not so much a philosophical opposition to the tax, it's really a pure economical opposition to the tax. So it doesn't really have the intended effect. And now we get the French and Indian War. And of course, the French and Indian War is going to have a devastating effect on the British economy. It's going to double their debt. And not to mention, at the end of the war, the British are going to decide to keep 10,000 red boots on the ground. It was thought that they might take those soldiers home, but in 1763, we have a Native American uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion, and the British Crown decided, no, we're going to keep boots on the ground. And this means there needs to be revenue to pay back the debt for the war, and revenue to keep those soldiers home. So with the Molasses Act expired in 1764, the British Parliament's going to pass another indirect tax called the Sugar Act. And now this actually cut the tax on molasses in half, but it provided for stricter enforcement. And it's that stricter enforcement that's really going to be kind of a feather in the goose of the colonists. That made no sense. They're not going to like it so much. And really, this is where the beginnings of the Sons of Liberty begin to formulate, with James Otis and Samuel Adams really organizing boycotts of the sugar tax, a push to buy local. Now, unfortunately for the British, there was also a downturn in the colonial economy when the Sugar Act was passed, and many of the colonists pointed to this sugar tax as being the culprit. It was probably because the war economy of the French and Indian War had ended, but nevertheless, the truth doesn't matter. It's what people think is the truth. So this really begins at least the roots of the revolution in terms of people like James Otis and Samuel Adams forming the Massachusetts Whigs, which is going to really become the Sons of Liberty. So that tax isn't going to do so well. In 1765, we get another tax. What are you thinking, British? Now, we had indirect taxes, but we had nothing like the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is a direct tax. They need to raise money. This is how they're going to do it. Every time you have a legal document, a newspaper, a magazine, my goodness gracious, playing cards, you have to put the funky stamp on there, which is going to cost you a pence. So if these indirect taxes didn't anger the American people, this direct tax is going to affect the personal livelihood of every single American colonist. And this is really going to put energy into the gas tank of the Sons of Liberty, of the Massachusetts Whigs, of this idea of no taxation without representation. It's not just an economical problem at this point, it's also a social political problem. So by 1766, even the British Crown knows the Stamp Act is no good, so they go ahead and repeal it. But at the same time, they're going to pass something called the Declaratory Act, which basically says we have the right to pass laws on the colonies. Go blow it out your nose. So the next step towards the Boston Tea Party is in 1767, when the British Parliament passes the Indemnity Act. And this is an act designed to help the British East India Company. It's a large multinational corporation. It's British. They need help. And they were paying a 25% tax on the tea that they brought to England. And the deal is going to be that they're going to get a 25% refund for any tea that is then shipped to the colonies. Now, of course, that revenue needs to be made up, and that's going to be made up in the same year, 1767, when the Parliament passes the Townsend's Act. This is going to be a tax on paper, on glass, on paint, and on, you guessed it, the most commonly consumed beverage in North America, tea. And this didn't go over so well. From 1767 to 1770, we have a growth in the resistance. Groups like the Sons of Liberty are gaining influence. They're starting to talk to other colonies in terms of the idea of being against these taxes, not just for economic reasons, but for political reasons. No taxation without representation. We had no say in these taxes. So by 1770, the British Crown has heard these complaints. They know it's serious, so they repeal most of the taxes, but they're not going to repeal the tax on tea. They wanted to keep at least one tax in there to show the colonists, in a sense, we're in charge. Now we're going to keep the ball rolling. rolling. In 1772, the Indemnity Act is going to expire. This was that 25% refund that the British East India Company was getting. Now they're tightening the economic belt here. The British are only going to refund them 10% for tea that is brought to the colonies, but they're also going to raise taxes on tea in England. And this is going to have a devastating effect on the British East India Company. When prices go up, sales go down, and now they're going to have a huge surplus of tea. Now, the British government wants to save the British East India Company. Now, the East India Company actually wanted to eliminate the Townsend Act, but the Townsend Act, the tax on tea, was going directly to pay for colonial governors and judges. Now, this is also, in a sense, a form of control. They're not being paid by colonial assemblies. They're being paid by the crown, in a sense, through this tax. So the control comes from England. This was another reason groups like the Sons of Liberty were opposed to these forms of taxes, because they were being used to pay officials, which meant those officials were not being paid and being used to represent the colonists themselves. So now we have brought ourselves to 1773, and the British Crown thinks they figured it out. And in 1773, they passed the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is going to, number one, fully do that 25% refund for the British East India Company. It's going to keep the tax on tea in the colonies, 3 pence per pound, my boy. But it's also going to take out the middleman. The British East India Company always had to go to Great Britain and then bring the tea from there to here. Now they can bring the tea directly to the port. That means they're going to have more profit. But the colonists, they don't like this one bit. They see this as a form of control. Not only this idea of no taxation without representation, but now, in a sense, they're being used to bail out a huge British company. And that British company is monopolizing that industry of tea. And if they can monopolize the tea industry, who says they can't monopolize every part of the American economy? So we're getting closer, guys. That was a lot to go through, but now we're in 1773. Oh, what a night. Late December, on December 16th, 1773. Let's do it. So in the fall of 1773, the British East India Company is going to pack 7 ships with 2,000 chests of over 500,000 pounds of tea headed for North America. 4 of the ships to Boston, 1 to Charleston, 1 to New York, and 1 to Philly. But at this point, the colonial opposition is well organized, and there's incredible pressure on these merchants on consignment that are going to take the tea to not take the tea. And that happens in Charleston, it happens in New York and Philly, where the boats are turned around. But in Boston, it was the sons of the royal governor who are going to be the merchants on consignment, and they're not going to reject the tea, but they're also not going to be able to pick it up. So in late November, the Dartmouth arrives. Later, the Eleanor and the Beaver are going to arrive. The William was destroyed at sea. But on November 29th of 1773, Sam Adams is going to have a huge meeting in Boston to discuss what needs to be done about this situation. And it's agreed that something drastic needs to be done. We don't know quite what it's going to be, but they're demanding that this tea be returned to Great Britain, and they're sending 25 armed men down to the docks to protect those ships from having the tea being taken off the ships. And that stalemate is going to exist into December, the big night, December 16th, 1773, where Sam Adams is going to have one big meeting with over 7,000 people. And many people think that he gave the signal for the Boston Tea Party with the words to the effect of, this meeting can do no more to solve our problem. And that's where action occurred. Now, we don't have a lot of primary documents. It was thought that these people that participated, anywhere from 30 to 150, were sworn to secrecy for 50 years. So there's not a lot of personal accounts of the Boston Tea Party. But they did dress as Mohawk Indians. It wasn't a very good attempt, but they took charcoal and put it on their faces and feathers in their caps, and they grabbed some tomahawks and they marched down to the docks. Now, one of the ideas is that they were dressing as Native Americans, not so much as a disguise, but to make a point that they were identifying with being American and not British. Now, the actual Boston Tea Party lasted for about 3 hours. This big group divided themselves into 3 groups, smaller groups, where they got onto the boats. There was no resistance. Remember that the Boston Massacre occurred in 1770, so British soldiers were not so commonplace at that point in Boston, and they used their tomahawks and they bashed open the chest of tea and they dumped all that tea, about $1 million worth of tea in today's money, into the Boston harbor to make a point that the American colonists weren't going to take it anymore from the British Parliament. And now we got a fight on our hands. How about that, boys and girls? Because you know the British Parliament's not going to be like, oh, they dumped it in the bay. Oh, that's terrible. Let's move on. Nope, there's going to be consequences. So why don't we look at those consequences right up now? So the consequences are going to be harsh and the justice is going to be swift. Now, the intention of the Coercion Acts, or the Intolerable Acts as called by the colonists, was to make an example out of the Massachusetts colony. The British Empire wanted to show the other colonies this is what happens when you get out of line with the British Empire. So number one, we get the Boston Port Act. No business for you. We're going to close the Boston port. The Massachusetts Government Act. No representation for you. We're going to kind of kill the colonial assemblies. The Quartering Act, which gave British soldiers permission to take up residence where there was none available for them. No housing for you. And finally, the Administration of Justice Act, which is going to move many trials off American soil into the British realm. So this isn't going to go over very well. The resistance is just going to get stronger. And this is really going to lead to the First Continental Congress, where the colonies are going to meet and they're going to agree to defend each other. And of course, eventually that's going to bring us to Lexington and Concord and the sparking of the Revolutionary War. So there you go, guys. That was a lot of talking for the Boston Tea Party, but you can see that it's much more layered and complex than just a bunch of colonists dressing up as Native Americans and going to town on a ship with some tea. So we hope that your brain's a lot bigger, and we certainly hope that if you haven't subscribed to Hip Hughes History, you do that right now, or you forever face the consequences. There's really no consequences. You just really should subscribe. How about that? And I'll say it because I say it at the end of every lecture I've ever given. I'm going to say it right now because I mean with all my heart. Where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you guys next time at your press. My buttons.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is officially the end of today's lesson on the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party. This is Mr. Blumendahl officially signing off of the lesson recording. Until next time.